To be home, and a little none the worse for wear, a little cold, but some of us are settling in. I was on 5-6 different airplane flights over the past week, traveling here and there, but had a good time recruiting for the divinity school and got to see Mitchell, which was great. I'm getting used to this having an adult child thing who lives halfway across the country, so it was really good to see him. I am also grateful that Danielle was able to be here. I know she did a wonderful job, and I know that it meant a lot to her to be here. I think she is fueled by the love that this congregation gives her, so I know she was looking forward to it, and I know that you've enjoyed her. I had the honor to be a part of the licensing at Salem Baptist Church last night for my friend Yvette Breckenridge, who visits with us periodically. You may remember Yvette, and she has a son who a few people thought was Mitchell at first, but it's Carrington. But she is I was the first woman to be recognized in ministry. I was already in the process for ordination with the disciples when we came to Salem. So Yvette is actually the first woman that church has actually licensed in ministry. So it's a pretty amazing day, and I got to be the one to participate in the ritual of escorting her into the pulpit and then being the first one to greet her after the congregation had taken its vote. So I am pretty excited, although a little more tired than I normally am on Sunday night. There's a reason why I don't go to church at Salem on Sunday night. It takes a lot of out of me. But I had months ago, when we were preparing our worship plan and thinking through the texts and the scriptures, been pretty pleased with myself for this nifty little way in which I had expressed the title of today's sermon. It's God.Is.Faithful, but if you pay attention to how it's up there, God, period, is, period, faithful. There should be another period. Have you ever seen on social media, those of you who are on social media, sometimes that is just a way of being concise and insistent and to the point. That is all. Have you ever seen people say that? Well, God, period, is, period, faithful, period. And weeks ago, when I thought of this, I thought, oh, that's a clever way of doing this title. And this Hebrew text, I'm in such agreement with Bill that this is a text that speaks to me, in particular verse 23. Let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who has promised is faithful. I did not know how much we would read that text today and this week. Earlier this week, I spent time on several different campuses recruiting for the divinity school and talking to young people who are interested in doing master's or doctorate degrees. I traveled with representatives from 6 other very fine institutions, including Yale, Harvard, Emory, Candler School of Theology, Duke Divinity School, and Union Theological Seminary, as their representative says, in the city of New York. And we talk to young people who are interested in making a difference, people who are interested in living out what they believe is a calling in their life, interested in perhaps going on to teach in the academy or in seminaries, interested in doing something that matters, interested in doing something that is beyond who they are. And it's always informative to me. Sometimes you get people who are, how shall we say, impressed with their own brilliance and want you to be also impressed. We have people who are very shy and just ask a lot of questions. And then there are people who really want to know what your institution is about. What's the diversity like in your student body and on your faculty? What kind of courses do you offer? What's the community like? One young man at Azusa Pacific University asked me if it was true that master's students at the University of Chicago were competitive and mean. And I said, well, of course not. We create a wonderful community there. Lots of different questions. one young man at Santa Clara University asked me this question: what do people really care about on your campus? And if I go there to prepare for ministry, will I be able to be engaged in the communities around the university? And I talked to him about the university's Community Service Center, which does a really good job of matching student interests with various community organizations, and does a good job of trying to give students a way to be both advocates and activists and participants in the work that's going on in the city of Chicago. And then a young African American student walked up to me today and said, what are students on your campus doing in response to the situation at Missouri and Yale? And as it turned out, there was a protest that students led at the University of Chicago on Friday, which I missed, and which I wrote to several students about, expressing my regret that I couldn't be there to stand in solidarity. And then as I headed towards the plane on Friday, word began to pour in about the attacks in Paris. And it just seems like there's just a continuous onslaught of violence and hatred and vitriol and antagonism and uncivil dialogue and racist and bigoted and homophobic conversation going on everywhere we turn. How then can we still say, in a world where human beings seem to value one another so little at times, that God is faithful? Years ago when I taught a new members class at Salem, I did not know that this particular couple in the class had a personal situation, but we were talking about prayer and what happens when you pray and pray and pray, and God doesn't give you the answer that you want. We are praying every Tuesday, and we invite you to put stickies up to indicate not only your prayer requests, but also the new board that asks you to place your answered prayers there. And I said, if God is not faithful when he doesn't answer our prayers, then he's not faithful when he does. We begin and end, as I like to say, with who we believe God to be. God is big enough to handle our disappointments. God is big enough to handle our frustrations. God is big enough to handle our weaknesses. God is big enough to handle our failure to respect his creation. God is big enough, even in times of extreme violence and terror, racism and homophobia, and lack of respect for human beings. God is still big enough to be God. And the God that my theology would describe as a God of love, a God of inclusion, a God of peace, a God of justice, a God of mercy, a God of compassion. And for those who would condemn the belief in God during a time like this, we have to remember that we are created with free will, and that human beings are not robots. And so God does not move. Human beings take action, and human beings make decisions that violate the law of God, that violate the understanding of humanity. And it's even important to understand the various religious and textual contexts in which certain human actors operate. There was a great article on the Atlantic website that attempted to explain the actual theology of ISIS, which I don't have time to go a long bit into, but I think it's helpful, and I'm going to put a link on my Facebook page for those of you who are on social media. As opposed to the Al-Qaeda group, who simply want a particular theology or philosophy of Islam to reign, and who see everyone as infidels and believe that they are called to a spirit of jihad for those who don't follow the Muslim way. ISIS believes in actually establishing what they call a caliphate, or a state. And so their beliefs are tied to specific geography, having control over specific geography. And they are very fundamentalist in their understanding of the Quran. They are not paying attention to historical context in the same way that we might look at a text and say, oh, well, that was written in like 400 BC, and so the language and the cultural mores of that time wouldn't apply to our time. ISIS scholars, according to this article, are actually looking at the actions of the Prophet Muhammad ahistorically. In other words, they're looking at what Muhammad advocated then and applying it to today's time. The chief focus of their rage would be Muslims that they believe have not been true to the teachings of Muhammad as listed in the Quran. They seem to give a pass to certain people, but it's more about establishing a geographical dominance, which is why taking over a city in Iraq is really important. I share this only because it helps us to understand perhaps why, even though we vehemently disagree, but it helps us to better understand why, for these people, striking terror into the hearts of people is so important. Their goal is to ultimately establish geographic dominance for the nation, for the nation known as a caliphate, that they believe should be completely submitted to Sharia law. We don't get this. We don't understand this. Just as we don't understand why for years and years people used the Bible to preach that black people were condemned and cursed because of a curse that Noah placed on Canaan, his grandson. This is normally referred to as the curse of Ham, and with the mythological understanding that people of color, particularly people of African descent, were descended from Noah's son Ham. It's actually Canaan, the grandson, who was cursed for failing to cover Noah when he became a drunken stupor in his tent. Noah in a drunken stupor in his tent. Just as we have used the Bible when Paul says, slaves, obey your masters, people for generations, use that to justify the system of chattel slavery in the United States, not understanding the context of that particular system in the first century. Just as there are people who continue to use pieces of the Bible to support and justify racist, bigoted, and homophobic stances in our world. So what then does God say? God reminds us that He is the person to whom we look. In Psalm 121 it says, I look to the hills from which cometh my help. My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. He will not suffer thy foot to be moved. Behold, he that keeps Israel will neither slumbers nor sleeps. The Lord is the shade upon thy right hand. He will keep you in all your ways. Isaiah 40 reminds us, comfort my people, remind them that I am still with them. I preached on this at General Assembly, and the focus of my sermon was not to deny the fact that God comforts, but to remind us all that God does not comfort us just to sit back. God comforts us so that we're able and ready to continue to move in action so that the rest of the world, with its hurts and pains, can also be comforted. The writer of Hebrews, whom we don't know, is making a case to his fellow Hebrews that Jesus is the answer to God's promise. He's reminding them that though it looks difficult, he reminds them of all the promises that God has made. The covenant with David, that the throne of Israel would not leave that house, that from that house would come not only a ruler, but a Messiah, a Savior. Isaiah, beginning in the second half of his book, chapter 40, reminds us and reminds his people that God has not forgotten them, even though they are conquered and scattered and strewn hither and thither. God is yet God, that they who wait upon the Lord will renew their strength, and they will mount up on wings as eagles. The writer of Hebrews says, let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who has promised is faithful. Hearts breaking, tears falling, minds just not understanding. People arguing on Facebook whether Paris or Kenya or Lebanon or Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter. The church is with it. The church has nothing to say. That's where I get upset. When people will throw away God because it seems like things are not going well. But I hold fast to the confession of my hope without wavering, for I really do believe that he who has promised is faithful. And let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds. Without exception, the people in the world who are wreaking violence upon their fellow human beings are people whom their society has marginalized. These are people who live in poverty. These are people who see no hope. We have only to look at our own streets in the city of Chicago, and even as I'm watching my email, I am hearing of violence right here in Downers Grove. Imagine. So much is going on in the world, and there is a sense that people who do not have are kind of tired of it. And sometimes people will use false justifications simply because they see no hope, they see no compassion, they feel neglected, and because no one is engaging them in rational and respectful ways, radicalism, fundamentalism can fill the gap when love is not present. So let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another. We can't sit here in our now nicely heated sanctuary and pretend that everything that's going on around us doesn't affect us. We have certain kinds of privilege in this room, be it privilege of race, be it privilege of class, privilege of education, privilege of income, where some of these things just don't affect us. Many of us have never seen bombs fall, but some of us have seen bullet-ridden bodies and bloods in the streets. Some of us have seen the impact of drugs and gang warfare. Some of us have just seen the impact of poverty. Some of us have seen people who are war-hardened and so cynical, believing that life is hell and your God isn't doing anything for me. Let us hold fast, unwavering, to the confession of our hope. That is all I have to offer, is hope in God and hope in Jesus Christ. I believe that God is bigger than all that we face. I believe God is the answer. I believe the love of Jesus Christ is the answer. And it's not enough for me to just say it. I must continue to live it. I must continue to live out how we as Christians voice that. My friend Shonda Jha, who is an activist in the Oakland area, director of the Oakland Peace Center, and the author of a wonderful new book called Pre-Post Racial Reconciliation in America, which deals not only with the question of white and black, but the question of Asian and Muslim relations. She and I broke bread together in San Francisco. And we talked about her book, and we talked about this church, and we talked about just life in general and the work of the disciples of Christ, and what's happening with reconciliation ministries, and what's happening with churches who wish to become multicultural. And she posted a picture of us together on Facebook, and she said, 1 more hour and we would have solved all the problems. I don't think that's true, but I do know that I felt so grateful to be able to have her during this past week. When so much is happening in the world, when the breaking of my heart is caused not even so much by the violence, but by the fact that people are giving up on God because of it. We cannot do that. We have to continue to believe that He who promised is faithful, and that as we gather together and strengthen one another for the work of God's kingdom, that it will make a difference. God is faithful. God, period, is, period, faithful, period. God is faithful, period. And if we don't give up on God, and if we try to live out what He has called us to do, I believe that He will not let us down. Let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering. For He who has promised is faithful. Let the waters rage, let the seas roar, let the mountains be crumbled into the sea. He who promised